There will also be some refreshments after the talk, if you'd like, because we have a lot left over. So that'll be in the auditorium. And also, we will receive a free will offering if you would like to contribute. The money will not go to Father Fessio or Ignatius Press. He said, I will not take any money. But we'll put it towards our speakers series. Every other month, we're trying to bring in a speaker of interest. So on January 31st, we will have Father Gary Thomas speaking about his deliverance ministry in the Diocese of San Jose. He's the diocesan exorcist, and the subject of a book called The Right, which was made into a movie with Anthony Hopkins. So he'll be our speaker in January 31st. And the funds we put into a big pot and we pay speakers. Some of them require larger fees than others. Some don't even require fees. And then there's hospitality. So anything you can contribute or nothing, it's a free roll-off. We welcome Father Fessio for a third time.
I understand that there will be a free will offering requested for the Speakers Fund. I don't take stipends, but I urge you to give generously so that you can improve on the speakers that you have here for this series. This is the final part of a three-part talk on themes of the Mass that are found in this book by Joseph Conrad Ratzinger, The Spirit of Liturgy. And on the first evening, I spoke about the chapter on liturgy and life, in which Conrad Ratzinger explains so beautifully how worship, personal morality, social ethics are inseparably bound, and how without proper worship and the right attitude towards God, there will be no authentic morality, and that social life will turn into injustice. And then I spoke in this chapter on cosmos and history, which sets the whole Mass in this much larger context of the whole universe that God has created, going out from himself. And then it's for human history, it's for a covenant with us, and its intent is to bring us and the cosmos back to God and to share God's life, to divinize us. And last night we talked about the transition from Old Testament worship to New Testament worship, the synagogue, liturgy of the Word, the temple, the sacrifice, united in Christ who is the Word and the sacrifice, and then mirrored and echoed down the ages in the Holy Mass, in which we have the liturgy of the Word, the synagogue liturgy, and the liturgy of sacrifice of Christ's death and resurrection. And I spent quite a bit of time on a very simple point, the direction of prayer. Why we face east as a symbol facing east, the rising sun, the crucifix, that shows that we're part of a cosmic liturgy, all coming back to the Father, the Creator Father, but through the cross, through history. So facing east is another way of uniting those two essential elements of the Mass, the historical and the cosmic. Tonight I want to speak about active participation and 3 or 4 of the elements that Karl Ratzinger mentions in his book that have to do with that participation. begin by one small but very important section in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. Just as I said last night, this was the first document issued by the Second Vatican Council on December 4th, 1963. It was on the liturgy. It was a historic document that was, as Ratzinger says, the culmination of the great liturgical movement, capital L, capital M, of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this document was really the central document of all the council documents. And it itself explains in section 14 or paragraph 14 just what the purpose of this document was. And here's what the council says. Mother Church earnestly desires that all the faithful should be led to that full, conscious, and active participation in liturgical celebrations which is demanded by the very nature of the liturgy. Now, that's almost a word-for-word quote from Pius X's motu proprio in 1903, Tra Le Solitudine, on reform liturgy. It goes on, such participation by the Christian people as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a redeemed people, that's a quote from 1 Peter, is their right and duty by reason of the baptism. So, full, conscious, active participation. In the restoration, continues, and promotion of the sacred liturgy, this full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else. For it is a primary and indispensable source from which the faithful are to derive the true Christian spirit. So this liturgy is the center and source of our activity. And listen now how the sentence ends. Therefore, pastors of souls must zealously strive to achieve it, that is, this full, conscious, active participation. How? By means of the necessary instruction in all their pastoral work. So that the very first step to be taken, that the council asked to be taken, was better instruction. Let us understand better what this great mystery of the Eucharist is. It also talks about the importance of reviewing and renewing and reforming some of the liturgical practices. But the real central thrust of this document and of the council itself was greater education of the faithful in participation in the liturgy. In fact, there's a whole section on seminaries and courses that priests should take and formation of the laity for better understanding. And as you recall, on the first evening, I quoted from the preface of this book where Cardinal Ratzinger answers the question, why am I writing this book? And he uses the image of the Mass and the liturgy as a fresco that has been overlaid over the years with this film, that kind of covers up all the bright colors, and that the liturgical movement and the council uncovered the beauty of the liturgy, but it's now threatened by the environment, post-conciliar implementation, with destruction. He uses the word destruction here. And as I said, quoting from the preface, his hope in this book is that he could help to encourage a new liturgical movement to celebrate more worthily the sacred liturgy. And at the end of tonight's talk, I want to kind of summarize what the elements are which Cardinal Ratzinger believes are essential, that word again, wesentlich, in order that the renewal that the council intended be actually accomplished in the proper way. So, briefly, I'll take 4 elements. There's more in this book. 4 elements of participation. And the one may seem a little odd because it doesn't directly apply to the Mass, it seems, and that is adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Why is that connected with the Mass? And he explains in a chapter on the Blessed Sacrament that the Eucharist, for us to truly receive as food, which nourishes us, must be received in worship. And to be received in worship, we have to have contemplative time before our Lord in the Eucharist to appreciate more just what the Mass is. So he links very closely the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament with the proper attitude for receiving communion, which is, as he mentions, and this is very clear in all the better theologians, the central part of the Mass is not the consecration. I know that when we kneel and when the host is lifted up, this is my body, and this is my blood, the chalice, that's a very solemn part of the Mass. That is when the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ. But that's not the high point of the Mass. Jesus became man that we might become God. That's a famous patristic saying. He took flesh and had the Last Supper that we might share in his life by consuming him as our nourishment. And so the true central moment, the most important moment of the Mass is not the consecration, it is communion. That is the moment when the bridegroom, Jesus, has become one with us in the communion, unites us to him and makes us one body with him. And so, Ratzinger's point here is that in order to experience and practice that communion in the deeper way, we have to prepare our hearts, our minds by adoration. He mentions clearly that there was no Blessed Sacrament as we know it. There was no tabernacle for the first 1,000 years of the Church. The Blessed Sacrament was reserved, but it was reserved back in the sacristy or to move apart to be brought to the sick. But there was no tabernacle in the way we know it. There was no benediction. There was no Eucharist adoration as we have in today's Church. And many theologians had said, both before and after the Council, well, we need to get back to that primitive faith because what happened in the Middle Ages was an accretion. It was a development which was a deviation from the simplicity of the early Church. And Ratzinger says, no, that's not the case. In fact, it was a development that was based upon the prayer, the experience, the theological understanding of Jesus' real presence. And so that as the awareness grew in the Church of just what this presence was, it became obvious we need a better place. We need to focus on this. We need to give this some emphasis. So that's the first thing I read. Just a couple of quotes from this chapter on page 85. Again, he never shies away from a problem. And so he starts the chapter right away by saying, first sentence, the Church of the first millennium knew nothing of tabernacles. So he admits the fact. This is a novelty in a sense. This is something which does not go back to the beginning. Then, on page 89, after discussing this whole fact that it was a development, he says, what happens in the Middle Ages is not a misunderstanding due to losing sight of what is central, but a new dimension of the reality of Christianity opening up through the experience of the saints, supported and illuminated by the reflection of theologians. So this idea of having a Blessed Sacrament, having adoration, this came from the holy ones, the saints, lay and clerical, reflected on by the theologians. At the same time, this new development is in complete continuity with what had always been believed hitherto. So it wasn't new in the sense of discontinuous, a rupture from the past. Let me say it again, he says. This deepened awareness of faith is impelled by the knowledge that in the consecrated species, he is there and remains there. When a man experiences this with every fiber of his heart and mind and senses, the consequence is inescapable. What's the consequence of really understanding and believing that Jesus is present? We must make a proper place for this presence. And so little by little, the tabernacle takes shape. And more, always in a spontaneous way, it takes the place previously occupied by the now disappeared Ark of the Covenant. I mentioned that the synagogue had a shrine of the Torah, which was the Ark of the Covenant. Remember the covenant, the Ark had the Torah inside it. So that was replaced by the Ambo. But then, more and more, the tabernacle was a further replacement of that Ark of the Covenant, of that shrine of the Torah. Finally, on page 90, this has to do with the importance of adoration. He says, so let no one say the Eucharist is for eating, not looking at. Now, many of you may not have heard that, but I heard that many, many times at the council from these so-called theologians. Oh, well, no, we're not supposed to look at the Eucharist. It's Jesus' sacrifice for us. It's at the Mass, it's a dynamic activity, and we receive him, but we don't keep him there and look at him. Ratzinger continues, it is not ordinary bread, as the most ancient traditions constantly emphasize. Eating it is a spiritual process involving the whole man. Eating it means worshiping it. So it's not just bread, even sacred bread. This is the body and blood of Christ. And to eat, to receive that way means to worship. Thus, adoration is not opposed to communion, nor is it really added to it. No, communion only reaches its true depth when it is supported and surrounded by adoration. The Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration, but simply signifies its complete fulfillment. So you actually are fulfilling communion when you adore. Finally, he says a church without the Eucharistic presence is somehow dead, even when it invites people to pray. But a church in which the eternal light is burning before the tabernacle is always alive, is always something more than a building made of stones. In this place, the Lord is always waiting for me, calling me, wanting to make me Eucharistic. In this way, he prepares me for the Eucharist, sets me in motion toward his return. That's very beautiful. But Karl Ratzinger, as a theologian and as a person, is a man of great synthesis. I mean, he holds things together in beautiful unity. It was not by chance that Pope John Paul II appointed Karl Ratzinger to be the head of the committee that was going to organize the Catechism of the Catholic Church back in the 1990s. And when you read the Catechism, you see it's not just a list of things that Catholics believe. It's an organic structure that places everything in its proper context, in its proper relationship. I once spent my entire week-long retreat, as Jesuits make it every year, meditating on the table of contents of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I mean, I'm telling you, it is a masterful, synthetic, organic presentation of all the important elements of our faith. And that was Ratzinger's genius. I remember as a student, we would have what's called a Hoch seminar, a high seminar with the doctoral students. And there'd be 8 or 10 of us sitting on a table. You'd be at the end, and one person would make a presentation, and the rest of us would comment, ask questions, and so on. And he would sit there not saying a word, except from time to time he'd say, well, Father so-and-so, what do you think about that? Or he'd call on me because my German wasn't very good. I was kind of afraid to say anything. Father Fessio, what do you think? I had to say something, So he was very good at listening and drawing out kind of everybody's contribution. At the end, and this was classic, and this was happening again and again, he would kind of sit there, he'd kind of look up at the wall, and he would summarize in maybe 2 big, long German sentences. He would summarize the whole 2-hour seminar, but everything important would be there, and given his proper emphasis, and it was like the concluding, finale of a symphony, where he just drew it all together. Well, that's what he does. And here, just as he drew together cosmos and history in the Mass, now he's drawing together adoration and communion. A word about posture. There are many different postures in Mass. We stand, we sit, we kneel. We don't dance. And there's been a movement, not just in America, but certainly in America, kind of against kneeling. I mean, there have been, in the past anyway, bishops, archbishops, cardinals who have said, you must stand during the Mass, and you must stand during communion. We must be one people of God, the risen people with the Lord, not cowering on our knees. Kneeling is not appropriate. It's a sign of penance. We don't do that during Easter. There's all sorts of opposition to kneeling in any form at any time during Mass. And, well, I won't get into certain religious orders who have what I call the sit-down Mass, where you sit down for the whole Mass. The whole Mass, where you stand for the Gospel and for Our Father, but you sit down for the rest. But that's not what the Church's rubrics call us to do, and it's definitely not what Karl Ratzinger thinks we should be doing. So he discusses the idea of kneeling, and he says it's not something which came from outside the Church. It is the Church's own culture. And it is not only the Church's culture, but it is Christological. And Jesus himself, Luke's Gospel, Agony Gardens, he knelt. Jesus himself knelt when he prayed there in that most powerful moment of his prayer. So Ratzinger actually spends quite a bit of time saying we must restore the practice of kneeling where it's appropriate, especially after the consecration in Mass where it's required, but also when we are going to receive the body of Christ. And there's Jesus, the King, before us. There's the bridegroom. Kneeling is the most appropriate response to that. Here are some of the things he says about this. I'm skipping a lot of the middle of this book, so I'm jumping ahead to page 184. And again, he doesn't shy away from problems. He starts out with the problem. He starts the section on posture and kneeling. He says, there are groups of no small influence who are trying to talk us out of kneeling. It doesn't suit our culture, they say, parenthesis, which culture? I mean, he also has a beautiful sarcasm. It's kind of a gentle sarcasm, but you see a bite to it if you're looking for it. It's not right for a grown man to do this. He should face God on his feet. Or again, it is not appropriate for a redeemed man. He's been set free by Christ and doesn't need to kneel anymore. So those are the objections, and if you haven't heard them, I mean, you need to spend more time keeping track of what the Church is doing, because that was very common many, many years ago, and it's still not so uncommon now. Next sentence. If we look at history, we can see that the Greeks and Romans rejected kneeling. So this wasn't something that Christianity got from the surrounding culture. Aristotle called it a barbaric form of behavior. The kneeling of Christians is not a form of enculturation into existing customs. It is quite the opposite, an expression of Christian culture, which transforms the existing culture through a new and deeper knowledge and experience of God. So it was Christians who introduced kneeling into liturgy, into the lives of not from outside culture, but because that was internally consistent with the Christian revelation. He continues, kneeling does not come from any culture. It comes from the Bible and its knowledge of God. Let's see here. I want to go to page 1. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Go to page 191. Worship is one of those fundamental acts that affect the whole man. That is why bending the knee before the presence of the living God is something we cannot abandon. And finally, page 193 and 194. The Christian liturgy is a cosmic liturgy, precisely because it bends the knee before the crucified and exalted Lord. Here is the center of authentic culture, the culture of truth. The humble gesture by which we fall at the feet of the Lord inserts us into the true path of life of the cosmos, going out from God, coming back from God in worship. And finally, it may well be that kneeling is in a modern culture, insofar as it is a culture. For this culture has turned away from the faith and no longer knows the one, capital O, before whom kneeling is the right, indeed the intrinsically necessary gesture. So of course it's not appropriate to our culture because we're a godless culture. Finally it says, the man who learns to believe learns also to kneel, and a faith or a liturgy no longer familiar with kneeling would be sick at the core. Again, I emphasize, this is a man who speaks with great moderation. So when he says something like this, I mean, it's a serious statement. The man who learns to believe learns also to kneel, and a faith or a liturgy no longer familiar with kneeling would be sick at the core. Let's turn to chant. This won't take as long because he doesn't say as much about it. He loves music. Of course, his brother, Georg, was the music director at the cathedral there in Regensburg, and he was the director of the famed Domspatzchor, the little dome, cathedral, Spatz, sparrow, chorale, or choir, the little boys' choir, famous all over Germany. Competed very well with the famous choir in Vienna, Vienna Boys' Choir. And so, again, here he mentions the fact that the church did not adapt something from outside itself when it began to sing. But this came from within. It started with the Psalms, and with the psalm tones, the chants. It was brought into the church, especially the Latin church, and it's become our tradition. And the Gregorian chant is central to that long tradition that goes back to the Jewish people. As I mentioned yesterday, when I talked to the rabbi, to Emmanuel, and he led me to the 1-800-JUDIM number, and when they led me to the rabbi in Manhattan, who told me, well, yeah, you guys got chant from us. The ancient chants the Catholic Church uses actually come from Jewish tradition. So briefly, he says, here's on page 143, very simple statement which echoes Vatican II. He says, in the musical sphere, biblical faith created its own form of culture, an expression appropriate to its inward essence. Inige Wesenheit, inward essence. One that provides a standard for all later forms of enculturation. So a standard, that by which you measure all other music. And then finally from page 145, in the West, in the form of Gregorian chant, the inherited tradition of psalm singing was developed to a new sublimity and purity, which set a permanent standard for sacred music related to church. So he's saying Gregorian chant is not an exotic exception to be used from time to time. It is the standard by which you measure any other music as being appropriate. In fact, I've thought of my the Fessio test for sacred liturgical music. Is you make a little CD thing, and you put in a beautiful Gregorian melody, and then whatever you want to put in the liturgy next to that, and then another Gregorian, and you listen right through. And if it jars you, if that one in the middle jars you, say throw it out. If it's polyphony, if it's beautiful, if it has the same kind of feel, the same kind of sensibility as chant, put it in. But chant is the standard. And this is said very clearly in paragraph 116 of Vatican Council II. The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, whatever that means, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. Gregorian chant, pride of place. I mean, how many parishes in your experience in the last 20 years have given Gregorian chant pride of place? Don't raise your hands. But other kinds of, this is the same 116, but other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebration so long as they accord with the spirit of the liturgical action as laid down in Article 30. So, again, chant is the only thing that should be the Mass, but it should have pride of place, and it should be the standard of everything else. Finally, a quick word on sacred language. Now, he's written elsewhere about that. He doesn't say much about it in this book. I'll just quote from two other writings of his, very briefly here. One was in a book called Feast of Faith, which was published in 1986. It had been said that the language of the Latin Rite was to remain Latin, although suitable scope was to be given the vernacular. Today, we might ask, is there a Latin Rite at all anymore? Now, it had been said, he's referring there, again, to Sacrosanctum Concilium, where in paragraph 36, it says, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. Now, that may surprise you, that this is the Second Vatican Council, paragraph 36. You can look it up. The use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. We're in the Latin rite, folks. And I ask you, in your normal parish experience the last 25 years, how much Latin have you found? Well, that's contra the Council. It does go on to say, in the second subparagraph here, but since the use of the mother tongue, whether in the Mass, the administration of the sacraments, or other parts of the liturgy, frequently may be of great advantage to the people. Therefore, the limits of its employment may be extended, that is, we may use more of the mother tongue. This will apply in the first place to the reading